I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
Very good to see everybody this morning. Our study this morning, we'll look in the book of John in chapter 8. I think probably best if we begin by reading this section, reading the whole section at one time. So maybe we can just start going 2 verses apiece. Start up at the front to the left here with Jeremy. We'll just do 2 apiece until we finish to verse 20.
But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Now early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came to him. And he sat down and taught them.
Then the scribes and Pharisees brought to him a woman caught in adultery, and when they had set her in the midst, they said to her, Teacher, this woman is caught in adultery in the very act.
Verse
Now
5.
Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say? This they said, testing him, that they might have something on which to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger, as though he did not hear.
So when they continued asking him, he raised himself up and said to them, He who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground.
And those who heard it, being convicted by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest even to the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had raised himself up and saw no one but the woman, he said to her, Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you?
She said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. Then spake Jesus again unto them, saying, I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life.
The Pharisees replied, You're making those claims about yourself. Such testimony is not valid. Jesus told them, These claims are valid, even though I make them about myself. For I know where I come from and where I am going, but you don't know this about me.
You judge according to the flesh. I judge no one. And yet, if I do judge, my judgment is true. For I am not unknown, but I am with the Father who sent me. It's also written in your law that the testimony of a true man is true.
Annie?
I'm one who bears witness of myself, and the Father who sent me bears witness of me. Then they said to him, Where is your Father? Jesus answered, You know either me nor my Father. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also.
These words Jesus spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, and no one laid hands on him, for his hour had not yet come.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Exact number of people.
Yeah, it worked out perfectly. Very good. So basically, we'll look at the situation here first to get a picture in our minds of what's happening. So question 1, if we look at verses 2 to 3, verse 9, verse 11 to 13, who do we see that is present during that time, that confrontation between the scribes and Pharisees and Jesus, and then who's present after that confrontation is concluded? Anybody see who we're dealing with here? Jared?
It's a large crowd that had come to hear Jesus. Often we think it's just the scribes, the Pharisees, the woman in adultery, and Jesus. No, there was a large crowd here too.
Right.
We were missing one.
What? Well, let me get the one I missed.
The man.
The man. Oh no, that. Oh,
Oh,
he
we're
wasn't
getting-
there.
yeah, we're
He
getting-
wasn't
Exactly,
there.
they
Yeah.
were missing one.
We're-
No, you didn't.
we're
Oh,
getting
yeah.
there.
Oh,
We're
I
there.
said.
Oh, okay.
We're just looking at the scenario and who is there at the time.
Yeah.
And that's the key, because some people forget there's a lot of other people there. This is in the temple, and we see actually in the beginning that Jesus is teaching people in the temple. This is where it begins. But then it is a certain group of scribes and Pharisees bring in a woman with them who they've accused of being caught in adultery. Go ahead, Jeremy.
And just for people's knowledge of the temple, the reason the scribes and Pharisees were there is they had the Sanhedrin was there too, at the temple.
Yes.
And so it's not like Jesus was in Jerusalem. It's very unique for him to be there, and they had this opportunity. They were there because they were already there, and they just had created this scenario that they could approach
Right.
Jesus with.
That's right. Jeremy uses the word Sanhedrin. That is a word used for the council of religious leaders, consisting of both Pharisees and Sadducees, as well as others. But that's the group of the leaders. They're called the Sanhedrin. So they would already be in the temple. This would be the place they would be normally. Because we see at the end of it, after a certain group had left, we see that Jesus continues in verse 12 to teach again. And again, he's teaching the people. And as a matter of fact, if we see in verse 13 that there are other Pharisees who are present in the temple and who, again, are questioning what Jesus is saying. But it is, as we see, that particular group of scribes and Pharisees who brought the woman with them, it is those only who have left. And really, that's kind of important to understanding why that happened. So question 2, we noticed in verse 5, what did the scribes and Pharisees say? They said, Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. What do you say? Now the question is that the law? Was that the commandment in the law?
It's not complete.
Yes.
It is a
It
commandment.
is the law, but it wasn't complete.
Okay. So it is, in fact, the law, what the law required. But as Jeremy says, and as probably everybody has noticed, there's something missing here. It's not complete. The law required, if we actually take a quick look at it, the law required, Exodus 20:10, it said, the man who commits adultery with another man's wife, he who commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death.
Leviticus 10. You said Exodus 10.
Sorry.
Oh,
Leviticus 20, verse 10, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Correct. Thank you. Yes, I don't know why.
Yeah.
Probably because they passed Leviticus on the way there, or Exodus on the way there.
Yeah.
So now, what they said was correct, but their use of the law, we see already there's something wrong with it.
People do that with the law today. Any law. They use it as a
Yes.
cudgel in order to try to bring people down, when that was never the purpose. The purpose of the law was to punish evildoers, yes.
Right.
But it was never to be used the way the Pharisees and the Sadducees were using it.
Right.
As a cudgel
Yes.
to try to...
Used wrongly.
Yeah.
Basically, they used that law, but we've already seen there's a problem in how they've used the law. That's just the first problem that we've noticed. There may be other problems as we look. But the first one is, there's no man there. And their words were, if we look, what did they specifically say? And I'm sure this is going to be brought up again. Their words were,
Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned.
verse 4. They said this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. Now, if she was caught in adultery, why is the man not brought?
In the very act.
Right, it's in the very act, so they have, obviously, the identity of the woman and the man. She was caught in the very act, according to their words. So what I realized as I went through these questions after I had written them out, I realized that question 4 should probably do before we do question 3. So we're going to skip ahead to question 4, come back to question 3 after. It really makes more sense. First of all, to decide what sin is Jesus actually referring to in verse 7, because his words are, and these are the words that are often quoted even if people don't know much about the Bible, they know how to say, "He is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first." Some of us may have heard of an expression, "People in glass houses shouldn't throw stones." Well, guess where they get that expression from? It's this idea here. He who is without sin, throw the first stone. So what sin do we feel is actually being referred to in verse 7? Because his words were, "He who is without sin." What sin is Jesus referring to? Bill?
Well, the Pharisees, the Jews, would have obviously known Ecclesiastes 7 and 20.
Okay.
We're told all men have sinned. So, in
Okay.
keeping with the context, I believe it's adultery. And for the Pharisees, Jesus even told them in Matthew that they were an adulterous generation.
Yes.
So that thought, that word, would be in their minds.
Okay. There's a possibility. Jeremy? And then
They-
Gord, because Gord's here.
They had sin in this matter. They did not follow the law correctly. And so when Jesus is pointing out to them, you've brought me this woman. She's in sin. He's not going, we'll get to that, we'll get to how he deals with her later. If they caught her in the very act, she's a sinner. She's obviously broken the law. So have they. And so how can someone who has broken the law that's bringing her, like in the very act of bringing her, has broken the law, how can they expect for him to condemn the woman and not them at the same time?
Right. Everybody understand that? Basically, we're going to look at the very first thing we've already talked about. They did not bring the man. If she was caught in adultery in the very act, as they said, they had to be 2 of them. Otherwise, it's not adultery. The law stated that they should both be stoned, the man and the woman. Where's the man? So they have already broken the law in what they've done in just that one instance. Now, is there something else in which they may have failed in keeping the law? Because, first of all, that is the main one. Jeremy points that out. It's clear to see. We can see it. We don't even live under the old law, but we recognize what the problem is. Now, imagine all the people there who lived under the law. Do you think they were capable of understanding exactly what Jesus was referring to? Yeah, they would recognize there's something wrong with this situation. These scribes and Pharisees that claim this woman was caught in adultery in the very act, yet only she's the one who's dragged here. Where's the man? But not only that, again, being caught in the act, let's look at Deuteronomy 17. Deuteronomy 17, verses 6 and 7. What we're told throughout the Old Testament is if someone is accused of something, it's necessary to have witnesses. We read in 17, verses 6 and 7, it says, "Whoever is deserving of death shall be put to death on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. He shall not be put to death on the testimony of 1 witness. The hands of the witnesses shall be the first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hands of all the people. So you shall put away the evil from among you." So first of all, they claim she was caught in the very act, yet they failed to produce the man. There's no witnesses either. There's no one standing up as they are the witnesses to this particular thing.
Plus, I sort of wonder, when you think about this scenario, how did they catch this woman in the act? They must have gone to some place looking for someone that they could do this to. So whether or not this woman was known, I'm not going to say that. But to catch someone in the act of adultery, you're in the temple. This is presumably, like as far as, it's very rare to catch someone in the act of adultery. It's very rare for that to happen in the very act. So it seems to me their motives going in, let's find someone, and do they go to someplace just looking for trouble? And doesn't excuse sin whatsoever, but when we go start looking for trouble, our heart's not in the right spot either, because they were wanting to condemn Jesus. They really didn't care about this woman.
Right. We do notice that the Bible tells us in verse 6, the Bible tells us their purpose for this, as Jeremy's saying. Oh, Gordon? Good.
I kind of feel like they were trying to test Jesus too, to
Verse
see
6.
his reaction. And
Yes.
of course, him, the ultimate teacher,
Yes.
really put them in their place
Right.
with very few words.
Yes. And that, very few, actually, because in some spots he simply said nothing and waited for them to think about what was happening. Absolutely. It says in verse 6 that their purpose in doing this, as Jeremy says, was not justice. It was a setup in order that they might have something to accuse him. What does he do? What side does he take? Does he require the stoning, and then maybe they can use that with the Romans, because they're not supposed to, they actually have no legal ability to put anyone to death. Or is Jesus going to be what they consider soft on God's law, saying, no, we don't do that. That would be wrong. And then, it's wrong to keep the old law. Problems again. So it was a setup. Jeremy?
Don't answer a fool according to his folly. That's from Proverbs. That's what Jesus is doing here.
Yes.
We often think, you always have to answer someone. Well, sometimes they're just so foolish that it's so obvious what they've done that there's really, what's the use of an argument with them?
Right. Yeah. Jeremy points out in the Old Testament to not answer a fool according to their folly. In other words, if someone is foolish, we don't engage in foolish arguments with them. We just end up justifying their foolishness, which Jesus did. He handled it, as he always does, exactly correctly. He exposed what the problem was, and as we've noticed, the very first problem was they are for some reason only taking this woman and neglecting to bring the man. It wouldn't be surprising, because Jesus not only accused them in many times of hypocrisy in how they act, but also in partiality. Partiality, if anyone's not familiar, is simply favoritism, is showing favor to one more than another. Why choose the woman, not the man? Because
maybe the man had some prominence,
yes.
respected, he didn't want to embarrass him.
Or simply because she was a woman and easier to manipulate. To drag around. Basically, to drag her around.
Well, really, we don't know, so we can only guess. And really, if it was,
some things we guess at.
If it was meant to be known,
yes.
It would have been known.
Right. We're not guessing, though, when the Bible tells us clearly they were guilty of hypocrisy and partiality, favoritism toward people. So this is consistent with the things that they do. Bill?
I'm not sure if somebody mentioned this. It's
Okay.
kind of hard for me to hear.
Okay.
But, Jesus already told the crowds, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, that he didn't come to judge and condemn. He came to save.
Right.
So as time went on, they saw his compassionate attitude, which was not normal for a man. And so they were, I believe, sometimes looking for traps where they could have him go against the law of Moses.
Absolutely.
And
verse 6.
Yeah, and they couldn't. How do you trap the master teacher?
They could, yes.
As we see,
right.
It blew their.
They could not trap Jesus because he was always consistent with the law of God, because he is God, being God, has given the law, which they do not understand, of course. He is the perfect one to handle the law appropriately and correctly. I'll mention one other thing, give us something to think about. When we look at the case of John the Baptist with King Herod, that's the main story is in Mark chapter 6. But when we look at that, we see John telling the king something, that he had violated the law by having his brother's wife. Jeremy pointed out to me last week, that's actually a specific law, that you shouldn't have your brother's wife. But he's in marriage, in a situation that he should not be in. He has his brother's wife. Why is it John the Baptist is telling Herod that? I look at everything I read through the New Testament. Why aren't the religious leaders pointing out that problem to the king? As a matter of fact, Herod, in particular Herod's wife, who shouldn't be Herod's wife, Herodias, she was that upset about it that she wanted his head. She wanted him put to death. If religious leaders had already taken care of this, if the religious leaders had been consistent with carrying out God's law, that would already be known to the king that he was in violation of the law. Why does it take John the Baptist to do that? Jeremy?
Forget too, John was a Levite, so he wasn't part of the religious leaders in the temple, but he did have that religious authority from God as a prophet. But he was also a Levite.
Yes.
And we sometimes forget that he knew the law just as well as anyone else did.
Yes. Yeah, he had well, really, I wouldn't restrict it to only him. I mean, anybody could tell the king this is wrong, but really it should come from the leadership. The leadership is always the one who should speak up and point out, because what are the point of having a leadership if they're not taking the lead in correcting things that are wrong? So here they are taking this woman, minus the man, again, showing their inconsistency and their violation of God's law. But on top of that, where are they in taking care of other problems, especially one that's so known by everyone? King doing that is known by everybody. No correction there. So it's interesting to notice that. One thing I did think also is in the back in the book of Leviticus, what it says about acting unjustly in Leviticus chapter 19. It says in verse 15 of Leviticus 19, it says that you shall do no injustice in judgment. This is what the leaders were required. They were not to do injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. They were not to show favoritism or partiality. But again, what do we see? We see them choosing one over, they have a man and a woman for whatever reason. And like Gord said, we may not know what that reason is, but we do know they only brought the woman, they didn't bring the man. They chose one over the other. So again, violation of God's law. So when we look in verse 7 and Jesus says, he who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first, we realize who he's directly referring to. Those scribes and Pharisees who have brought that woman. This is not even a place. This is not before the council. This is not a place for a legal trial anyways. But would we do that nowadays? Would we take someone who's been accused of something, take them out of the courthouse, and take them on the street or take them to some place and say, here, you judge this person, what do you think? That's a violation of the law. Someone who's accused is not supposed to be treated that way. They have to be judged fairly. I mean, witnesses, everything needs to be carried out correctly. But again, they violate God's word. And now do we find, if that is consistent, do we find that true in who left? Because who is it that actually left? It says that in verse 9, it says, then those who heard it, being convicted by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest even to the last. And Jesus was left alone and the woman standing in the midst. That's a verse where people think everybody that was there left. They felt bad about their conscience of having sinned sometime in their life, and everybody's left. But in fact, we realize, no. Jesus says, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you? And she said, no one, Lord. It's the accusers who have left. As a matter of fact, and we see in verse 12 and 13 that Jesus continues right back to where he was originally, teaching the people, and there still remains Pharisees in the temple. It is the accusers, the scribes and Pharisees, who brought that And my belief is that, well, obviously they've understood what they've done wrong, but I think they would feel the pressure of Jesus actually challenge them on it, and then they end up being tried for their actions. Best for them just to close their mouths and leave before things get worse. But either way, they are the ones who left. So which leads us to our question in question 3 then, is how is verse 7, and sometimes along with Matthew 7:1, because that's also a verse, scripture that I hear people who know nothing about the Bible can quote that one also. How is it often misunderstood and misused? And how does this misunderstanding contradict what the Bible actually teaches? So does anybody have any thoughts on how this is misused? Jeremy?
Never judge. You have sinned. I know you have sinned.
Right.
How can you judge me? Because you're just like, we always say sin is sin, and it is. Well, if sin is sin, you're telling me I'm a liar. Well, I know you're a thief. Why can you judge me on being a liar? I won't judge you on being a thief.
Yes.
That'd be the attitude that we'd have to have, right?
I'm glad Jeremy adds that. There's an underlying motive why this is so common. Let's talk more about a motive. But first, we're going to focus on how it's misunderstood. And there's one thing. Anybody have anything to add to that?
Sin according to Scripture, sin is lawlessness. Sin is violation of God's law. That's sin.
Okay.
But from beginning, this set up, Pharisees knows the law. They know the law.
They
That's
know
the
it.
problem. Yeah.
That
But
is-
they didn't obey the law.
Right.
They set up Jesus. Jesus also used their hearts.
Yes.
So Jesus don't use this sin as comparing. Your sin also, you couldn't cover the way to judge this woman. No, should be careful because you know the law.
Right.
They broke the law. And it is hypocrisy. Or see, they do part of the law and leave part of the law undone. That's the problem. Yeah.
Yes. There's the key, as Henry says, the hypocrisy that you do part of the law and leave the other part undone. You look for so-called justice for this woman of what she's done, and yet there's no justice for the man. There's not even witnesses who are present. You break the law. You leave part of the law undone. And so, people not recognizing this and misunderstanding what Jesus says when he says he is without sin among you. As Jeremy said, that people have this idea that if you've ever sinned, you have no right to judge anyone else for sinning. Now, well, first of all, is there any other thought? I'll get to Jeremy in a second. Gord?
Well, we are supposed to be our brother's keepers.
Yes.
So if we see a brother in error, we have to try and correct him.
Right.
But it's out of love,
Right.
right? We're not trying to condemn somebody. We're trying to restore them. So there's a little bit difference.
Motive again.
Yes.
Right. Proper use of the law is reason for using. Right. Jeremy?
Just as you had said, the context, maybe I hadn't caught that from verse 9 about Jesus being left alone.
Okay.
But it goes to the point, verse 3, when he says, let him who is without sin. Who is the him? Well, it has to be the scribes and the Pharisees, because they're the last ones mentioned. They're the ones being spoken. We often think, well, the crowd came. No, the crowd was there, and then the scribes and the Pharisees came.
Right.
And so, since they're the ones talking to Jesus, the him that was without sin has to be them.
Right.
Not the crowd, because the crowd would know nothing about this woman caught in adultery, so they wouldn't be casting any stones anyway.
Right. Yeah, good observation. I didn't notice that either. Yeah, let he who is without sin, Jesus is referring to them, the scribes and Pharisees who brought the woman. Let one of them begin. And again, that sin there, where people think, oh, that's just sin in general, because the Bible tells us, very simply, all have sinned. We don't argue that. That's absolutely correct. Jeremy?
And in that, Jesus is fulfilling the law. He is not denying that if she was caught in adultery and had been judged as an adulterer, guilty, that she deserved to be stoned.
Right.
But he wasn't going to give them this kangaroo court that they had set up and justify that.
I'm glad Jeremy brought that up. Annie? Go ahead.
If you read verses 5 of that Matthew chapter 7, it says, "Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thy own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly." You know, it's trying to point out to some people trying to be self-righteous.
Yes.
You know, that others are condemned.
Right.
They are going to hell, but themselves too, they are candidates of hell.
Yes.
So it's trying to say that being self-righteous is bad.
Right.
Try as much as possible to be improving on yourself. Try to work on yourself.
Yes.
Before looking at
Yes.
where others are living.
It's a good point. Annie makes a good point. It's this is specifically what Jesus is referring to in Matthew chapter 7 when he talked about taking the beam out of your own eye before you remove the speck from another's. They were guilty in this matter. We've already clarified that. The Bible shows it clearly in the Old Testament they were guilty in this. Yet they tried to judge another in the same matter in which they were guilty. They needed to correct themselves. Now this is where I would ask a question, because Jeremy brought this up and it's important. Would Jesus actually teach against what the Old Testament commandments were? Gore's shaking his head no, because absolutely not. We have to realize that. So look at it. If the Sanhedrin, if the Jewish rulers, Pharisees, Sadducees, if they were keeping God's law faithfully, if this was a situation in which it was a proper court setting, the woman and the man were brought under the proper conditions, the witnesses were there, they were clearly guilty, they were accused and guilty of adultery, and if the leaders were keeping this law consistently in the first place, not just against those that they could care less about, but on other people, like for example a king or one of their own who was guilty of something, and they hushed those things up. But if the law of God was always kept consistently, would Jesus said, oh no, we should not do that. We should not keep the law. Absolutely not. But then again, they wouldn't have needed a savior had the Jewish leaders been actually doing the things that are right, upholding the law of God. As a matter of fact, the nation would be pleasing to God. So it's a good point to remember.
And if they were following the law, they wouldn't have brought him to Jesus anyway. You'll get too late.
There you go. This kangaroo court, we have this word for a judgment that is inconsistent with law. We call it kangaroo court. This kangaroo court setting wouldn't even exist because they would never act that way, because they would already know how to carry out the law of God properly and effectively.
And it reminds me of a movie similar was one that Cal and I saw years ago called The Stoning of Sariah M, where the husband was, it's called The Stoning of Sariah M.
Okay, Sariah.
And where the husband was in adulterous relationship with another woman, and he wanted to get rid of his wife, so he made it look like she was the adulteress. Of course, she was the only one that got stoned. There was no man present in it. Right. You know, it's all false accusations.
Yes. Hypocrisy and partiality continues to be something that mankind faces every generation. Continues in any leadership setting. There's always the danger of partiality, favoritism, hypocrisy. And we study this, why? So we can better examine ourselves, to make sure when we carry out God's law, we don't do it in a partial or hypocritical manner. So question 3, specifically, so when people misunderstand what this means and thinks it just means that, well, generally anybody who sins, and everybody has, no one can judge anybody. What would be the problem with that? Why would that contradict the law of God? There's so many ways.
if you're never judging anybody, how is anyone being stoned in the first place?
Right.
There has to be a judgment there.
Right.
And so if no one can judge anyone, then everyone's guilty, but no punishment because of it.
Right.
Unless God strikes you down. If he strikes you down, well, then you got judged. But other than that, like the law, the whole point of the law is do good and you will be rewarded. Do bad and punishment follows.
Right.
But that requires a judgment.
Right. And this is the thing. People who use this idea of, well, Jesus means that if we've sinned, we should never. You can't judge another. Well, everybody sinned. It means no one can judge another. It means there can be no judgment. If you take that literally, as they're saying, and if they take it far enough, they realize you can't have a courthouse. You can't bring judgment on anyone. If anyone murders, shoots, kills, steals, lies, deceives, you can't judge any of those things. Even to go so far as a parent could not even discipline a child in raising them because the parent realized, well, I've done wrong. At some point in my life, I've done wrong. So how can I correct another? How can I discipline or judge No, that's not what Jesus is saying. But Jeremy?
And the world would scream injustice at that. I was reading a post this morning about someone who had been charged with murder, but because of some, I don't know the entire details, but he'd been let out on bond, and the family of the person who he is accused of murdering is just outraged, and probably rightfully so for that. But why are they outraged? Because it seems to be injustice. Well, if there is no judgment, how can we be able to scream injustice?
Right.
Like as far as we understand, when it affects us, when someone has hurt us, we want someone else to be judged guilty if they're guilty. But if it is us, then we want that. Oh no, please don't judge me harshly at all. Like as far as that's the whole.
We don't want to be judged. Right. It's a good point. Because we would have to ask ourselves, what is the motive then? What is the reason why people are so attracted to the idea of if you've done wrong, you can't judge another? It's because people don't want judgment in their life. They don't want to be corrected and told what you're doing is wrong. But this, I think, underlying as I studied through this, I don't know if anyone else, I'm assuming everybody did, actually, we begin to realize in order to have judgment and justice, you have to have a standard. This is the problem. The problem is, what standard are we using for judgment? We see with them, with the scribes and Pharisees, their standard of judgment was their own. It wasn't God's law, because as Henry pointed out, they done some and left some undone. That's not the standard of God's judgment. That's their own. But that's what Henry?
God has the authority to judge the people, because God is righteous judge. But to men, if you want to judge others, you have to follow the law. Not on, in this case, it's ordinary, completely.
Right.
And the man has no authority to judge others. But you can judge others according to the law, in the name of God. That's what we should do, to have the complete righteous trial procedures, and to this trial and completely not left some undone. Take whatever benefit to you.
Right. As Henry points out, this was the old law, which they lived under. But of course now we live under the new law. But either way, we have to understand what God requires of us. And that's how our judgments are based. Our judgments are based not on our law, because we're not bringing judgment on someone. And there's the idea, because we do have a question coming up, which we won't get to, is the difference between judging and condemning. Because I will ask, did Jesus judge the woman? Did he judge the woman? Gord says yes. And how did he? Can we point at something and say Jesus actually did judge the woman?
He told her, "Go and sin no more."
There we go. He told her what the wrong was. Go and sin no more. But he didn't condemn her in this case, because, quite as Jeremy pointed out, a kangaroo court, he called it. This is the wrong say. It was handled wrongly.
He wasn't the judge.
And he wasn't a judge. That's right. He wasn't a judge in Israel anyways. He was not one of the Sanhedrin. He was not in any legal position to cast a judgment. There's one thing people forget too. Pharisees certainly didn't respect him as a leader of Israel. Again, it's not a proper court setting. But he did judge. But did he condemn her? There's the difference between judge and condemn. Condemnation is always final. We talk about the judgment day. It's the day of condemnation. It is the final judgment when there's no more opportunity for change. And Gord brought this up earlier, which is good to remember. It would be our final thought, is that what is the purpose of judging? His purpose is to bring correction and change and repentance. Not to beat someone down. Jeremy said like a cudgel, where you're beating someone down with a judgment. You're showing them what is wrong, telling them this is God's standard. It's not mine and it's not yours. It's the standard of God. And you need to understand this so you can change your life, repent, and have a relationship with God. And that is the purpose of judging. But condemnation, we condemn no one. We don't tell someone, oh, you're completely lost in sin. There's nothing I could do with you. You're hopeless. It's a condemnation. Should never condemn anyone to hopelessness. As long as they have opportunity to correct what is wrong, they have an opportunity to change their life.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to